He slid that prenup across the table like he was doing me a favor. He wanted to protect his $5 million. He had absolutely no idea. There is a particular kind of woman that this country has always underestimated. She doesn't drive the flashiest car. She doesn't wear her net worth on her wrist. She doesn't need to. She moves through rooms and boardrooms and courtrooms without ever announcing what she's carrying, because the women who built what she inherited taught her something priceless, that the most powerful position you can occupy is the one nobody sees coming. Eleanor Voss was that woman, and for the 3 years she was married to Richard Hargrove, he never once thought to ask the right questions. He was too busy protecting himself from her, too busy drawing lines in the sand, too busy assuming that because she was quiet, she was small. He was wrong about almost everything. In the spring of 2019, Richard Hargrove sat across from his soon-to-be wife and placed a prenuptial agreement on the table. It was, he told his friends, just good business. He had built something. He wasn't about to lose it. What Richard didn't know, what he had never thought to investigate, never thought to ask, was that Eleanor's family attorney had been quietly managing a portfolio that dwarfed Richard's entire life's work by a factor of 40. While Richard was protecting $5 million, Eleanor was sitting on $200 million. And when their marriage fell apart 3 years later, when Richard decided he no longer wanted Eleanor and went looking for the fastest, cleanest exit he could find, he triggered a legal process that would unravel every assumption he had ever made about her, about money, about who exactly had the power in this marriage. This is the story of what happens when a man mistakes a woman's silence for weakness. Stay with us, because this story has more turns than Richard ever anticipated, and before it's over, you're going to wonder how he missed every single sign. But before we go any further, drop a comment right now. Would you have signed that prenup? Tell me what you would have done, because I want to hear from you. And make sure you're subscribed, because this story is just getting started. Now, before we go any further into what happened between Eleanor Voss and Richard Hargrove, I need you to understand something. This is not a story about a lucky woman who stumbled into money and then used it to embarrass a man who underestimated her. That would be too simple, and the truth is never that simple. This is a story about generational wealth built in silence. It is a story about a woman who was raised by a woman who understood, at a cellular level, that the world would not hand her what she deserved, so she went out and built it herself, quietly and methodically, and without anyone's permission. And it is a story about how that silence, that discipline, that absolute commitment to financial privacy eventually shaped the life of a daughter who never quite got the chance to step out of it, until a man named Richard Hargrove forced the issue by demanding she sign a contract designed to protect him from her. He had no idea that the woman sitting across that mahogany table was 40 times wealthier than he was. He had no idea that the prenup he was so proud of was, in the long arc of what was coming, almost beside the point entirely. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand Eleanor Voss, you have to go back to a woman named Patricia Voss. And to understand Patricia, you have to go back to a small town in Western Virginia in the early 1940s, which is a time and a place that most people watching this video did not live through, but that shaped the lives of women who did, in ways that are still rippling outward today. Patricia was born in 1941 to a family that had land but not liquidity, pride but not prosperity. Her father farmed. Her mother sewed. Both of them worked from before sunrise to after dark every single day of their adult lives, and they were not poor by the standards of their community, but they were not free either. They were bound to the land, to the season, to the mercy of weather and markets, and the particular economic reality of rural Virginia in an era when your options were largely shaped by your gender and your zip code, and not much else. Patricia watched all of this from childhood with the kind of quiet, burning attention that some children have. The kind that doesn't announce itself but is absorbing everything, cataloging everything, filing it away for a reckoning that hasn't arrived yet but is coming. She made a decision very early. Not a dramatic one, no speech, no declaration, no moment of cinematic clarity that she later described to anyone. Just a resolve, quiet and absolute, that her life would not be measured by the constraints she had inherited. that whatever she built would outlast her, that the daughter she hoped to have one day would never stand in a kitchen counting change at the end of the month, wondering whether there was enough. Patricia did not know yet what building that future would look like. She was 10 years old, living on a farm in Virginia, with no particular access to capital or connections or the tools of wealth accumulation. But she had something that turned out to be worth more than any of those things in the long run. She had patience, she had precision, and she had an almost preternatural understanding that the path to lasting security was not speed. It was consistency, invisibility, and the willingness to play a game that most people around you don't even know is being played. Patricia graduated high school in 1959. She attended a small college in Virginia, not because her family had money for it, but because she worked 2 jobs, saved with a discipline that her classmates found baffling, and secured a partial scholarship that covered the rest. She studied accounting, which was not the most common path for a woman in 1959, and which earned her a fair amount of commentary from people around her who thought it was an unusual choice. Patricia absorbed the commentary with the same expression she brought to everything, calm acknowledgement that didn't invite further discussion. She graduated in 1963 and married Harold Voss that same summer. Harold Voss was a good man. Let that be said plainly and without qualification. He was an engineer, steady and reliable, with a decent salary and no particular ambition beyond doing his work well and building a comfortable life. He was kind to Patricia. He was present. He never raised a hand to her, and he never belittled her, and he supported her decisions in the vague, unexamined way that men of his generation sometimes supported their wives. Which is to say, he didn't interfere. Harold liked things to run smoothly. He liked dinner on the table and bills paid, and the reasonable assurance that nothing was wrong. Patricia provided all of that. What Harold did not do, what he never thought to do, in the way that people don't examine the machinery that keeps a house running as long as it keeps running, was ask questions about money. Patricia handled the household accounts. This was their arrangement. It had always been their arrangement. And Harold, who trusted Patricia completely and also simply wasn't that interested in the details, never once sat down with her and asked her to show him where every dollar was going. This was, as it turned out, a consequential oversight. Not because Patricia was doing anything wrong, she wasn't, but because of what she was doing right, and what Harold would have discovered if he had ever asked. Patricia began investing in 1968. Their daughter Eleanor was 4 years old. The investment was small, a rental property on the edge of their town, a modest house that needed work, purchased with savings that Patricia had accumulated through 5 years of careful, invisible discipline. Harold knew they had savings. He knew in the vague way that people know things they haven't looked directly at. The way you know there's food in the freezer without being able to name every item. Patricia had managed their household on Harold's salary with such consistency and efficiency that there had always been money left over. She put it somewhere. Harold assumed it was in their savings account. Some of it was. The rest of it, by 1968, had become a rental property. The rental property produced income. Patricia reinvested the income. In 1972, she purchased a second property. In 1974, she signed a commercial lease on a small retail space that she rented to a dry cleaning business, a transaction that her neighbors, had they known about it, would have found astonishing. Because commercial real estate in 1974 was not a space that women in her community were participating in, and the few who were aware of what she was doing told her it was too complicated, too risky, not the right fit. Patricia listened to all of them with her characteristic attentiveness and went ahead and signed the paperwork. The dry cleaning business paid rent for 11 years. By the time that tenant moved on, Patricia had found another one before the space sat vacant for a month. By 1980, Patricia Voss had a portfolio of 7 properties across 2 states. Harold was aware, in a general way, that they had some real estate investments. He wasn't aware of the details. He trusted Patricia. He was busy with his own work. He had never had cause to look more carefully because everything at home was always fine. The bills were paid, Eleanor was fed and clothed and being raised well. Harold came home every evening to a household that functioned with the quiet efficiency of a well-run operation, and he never once looked behind the curtain to understand how that efficiency was being maintained and what it was building toward. Eleanor grew up watching her mother manage money the way some children grow up watching a parent practice an instrument. Not always understanding the complexity, but absorbing the rhythm, the discipline, the commitment to practice that happens every single day, whether anyone is watching or not. Patricia never sat Eleanor down for formal lessons. She didn't need to. She took Eleanor with her to look at properties. She explained, simply and without drama, what a lease was and why a tenant's creditworthiness mattered. She walked Eleanor through the household accounting when Eleanor was old enough to follow it, not as instruction, but as shared work. The way a farmer walks a child through the planting, not to teach agriculture, but to transmit a way of being in the world. Eleanor learned. She learned all of it. And she learned the lesson that ran underneath all the practical knowledge, like a current beneath water. This is private. What we build quietly. The world doesn't need to know what's in our pocket before we've decided what to do with it. Harold Voss passed away in 1991 from a heart attack. He was 61 years old. Eleanor was 27. Patricia was 50. The grief in that household was real, and it lasted, and nobody watching this should minimize it. Harold had been a good man. His absence was felt. But what happened in the months following Harold's death? The process of settling his estate, of reviewing the full financial picture that Patricia had built over 30 years, was one of the quietly stunning moments in Eleanor's life, because it was the first time she saw the full architecture of what her mother had constructed. Harold's estate attorney, a man named Charles Wentworth, who was 29 years old and who would go on to manage the Voss family finances for the next 3 decades, sat across a table from Patricia and reviewed the assets with the expression of a man who understood he was in the presence of something extraordinary. Patricia had organized everything. Every title, every trust document, every beneficiary designation, every lease, every property record. She had anticipated this process with the same precision she brought to everything else, and she had made it clean and efficient and completely under control. Eleanor sat in that meeting and watched her mother move through the most difficult period of her life with the steady, unflappable competence that had always defined her. And she understood something that afternoon that she carried for the rest of her life. Her mother was not just a careful woman. Her mother was a builder. And what she had built, the portfolio, the structures, the careful architecture of financial security, was the truest expression of who she was, more than any title or recognition or public acknowledgement would have been. Patricia would never have wanted the world to know what she had accumulated. The privacy was not a sacrifice. The privacy was the point. Charles Wentworth stayed. He became Patricia's attorney, and then, as the years passed and Eleanor became the person who would inherit what Patricia had built, he became the family's attorney in the fullest sense, a keeper of numbers and structures and long-term plans that extended out decades. He was not a flashy man. He ran a modest practice. He did not discuss his clients with anyone under any circumstances. He had, in 30 years, never once told anyone outside the Voss family what was in those accounts. This discretion was not just professional habit. It was a value he shared with Patricia, an understanding that the power of what she had built depended in part on its invisibility, on the world's continued failure to imagine that a woman who drove a Buick and shopped at the same grocery store she'd shopped at for 40 years could be sitting on anything that would make them look twice. The portfolio grew through the 1990s. Past 50 million, past 100. Patricia added to it with the same methodical consistency she had always brought, reinvesting returns, making careful acquisitions, never over-leveraging, never gambling. She was not trying to be the richest person in any room. She was trying to build something that would last, something that would hold, something that Eleanor and her children and their children would be able to stand on without the ground shifting beneath their feet. When the portfolio crossed 150 million in 2005, Patricia did not celebrate. She reviewed the accounting with Charles, made a few adjustments to the trust structure, and went home to the same house she'd lived in for 30 years and made dinner. Eleanor called that evening and Patricia mentioned that she'd had a productive meeting with Charles. That was all she said. Patricia Voss died in November of 2013. She was 72 years old. She died at home, in the house where Eleanor had grown up, with Eleanor sitting beside her. The end came slowly, over the course of several months, and it gave them time, not to settle accounts or make dramatic final statements, but to simply be together in the way they had always been. talking about books and properties, and what Eleanor was teaching that semester, and the particular quality of light in that house in autumn. Patricia did not spend her final months expressing regret. She had built what she intended to build. She had raised the daughter she intended to raise. She had protected both of them in ways that extended forward into a future she wouldn't be present to see, and she died with the quiet satisfaction of a person who had done the work and done it right. She left Eleanor a portfolio worth, by Charles Wentworth's accounting at the time of her death, $187 million. Eleanor sat with that number for a long time. She had known, in a general way, what her mother had built. She had been part of it, adjacent to it, aware of its shape without always knowing its precise dimensions. But sitting with Charles in the weeks after the funeral, reviewing the full accounting, was a different experience entirely. It was grief and awe, and a weight that she had not anticipated. Not the weight of obligation, but the weight of inheritance in its deepest sense. Not just money. A life's work, a woman's discipline. 50 years of quiet, consistent, invisible building passed from one set of hands to another. Eleanor took her time. She didn't make dramatic changes. She trusted Charles. She let the portfolio continue to do what it had always done under his careful management. She returned to her work. She had been teaching English literature at a university in the Midwest for a decade by then, courses on Victorian fiction and narrative structure that she genuinely loved, and she let the months pass. The number grew modestly. By 2017, by the time Eleanor met Richard Hargrove at a faculty fundraiser on a Thursday evening in October, the Patricia Voss Irrevocable Family Trust was worth just over $200 million. Eleanor Voss walked into that fundraiser wearing a navy blazer she had owned for 6 years and carrying a glass of white wine, and she did not look like a woman worth $200 million. She looked like exactly what she was, a 56-year-old English professor who was comfortable, confident, and completely herself. She had her mother's posture, straight without being rigid, present without being performative. She was not working the room in the way that people who need something from rooms tend to work them. She was simply there, talking to colleagues, genuinely engaged with the conversations she was having, untroubled by the necessity of making an impression. Richard Hargrove was working the room. He was good at it. He was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, with a confidence that was not unearned. He had built something real, and it showed in the way he moved through a space. A man who had always been the person in the room with something to offer. He had come to the fundraiser because one of his commercial tenants was affiliated with the university, and because Richard had always understood that showing up was a form of business strategy. He was not there looking for a relationship. He had been divorced for 11 years. He had dated, here and there, without particular urgency. He had his work, his daughter Diana, his properties, his routines. He was not, by his own account, a man who was lonely. He was a man who was complete in a way that had calcified slightly over the years into something that looked like self-sufficiency and sometimes felt, in the quiet hours, like something else. He sat down next to Eleanor because the seat was open and the conversation nearby looked more interesting than the one he'd just left. She said something dry and precise about the guest speaker that made him laugh. A real laugh, not a social one, and he found himself, for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, genuinely curious about the person he was talking to. Not in the transactional way that networking events produce curiosity. In the old-fashioned way, he wanted to know more. He asked her questions and listened to the answers. Eleanor answered and asked her own questions, and pushed back on 2 things he said, with a directness that he found bracing. They talked for an hour and a half. When the event ended and they walked out into the October air, Richard asked if she wanted to have dinner the following week. Eleanor said yes. What she did not say, in that conversation or in any of the months of courtship that followed, was anything substantive about her financial situation. This was not a strategic withholding, not exactly. It was simply who she was, how she had always been, the way of moving through the world that her mother had built into her. You don't lead with money. You don't discuss it until there's a reason to discuss it. You don't hand someone a picture of your full financial life before you've decided whether they're the right person to hold it. Eleanor had never told a man she was dating about the trust. It had never come up naturally, because Eleanor's daily life did not surface it. She drove a sensible car. She owned her home, which was lovely, but not ostentatious. She ate at good restaurants when she wanted to, and ordered the things she actually wanted to eat. She traveled when the academic calendar allowed. Coastal Portugal, the Scottish Highlands, a week in Sicily that she still thought about regularly. None of this signaled $200 million. None of it was meant to. Richard saw a woman who was comfortable, a woman who had clearly done well for herself, by professor standards, with a paid-off home and a life that seemed full and self-directed. He found her composure attractive. He found her intellect attractive. He found, surprisingly, that he enjoyed being with someone who clearly did not need him in the financial sense, who wasn't angling for security, who wasn't assessing his portfolio with the sideways calculation he had learned to detect in the years since his first divorce. Eleanor was not impressed by his commercial real estate. She acknowledged it pleasantly when he talked about it, and then moved the conversation to something else. He could not tell whether this was a strategy or simply who she was. He eventually concluded it was who she was, and he found it more appealing than anything deliberately impressive could have been. They dated for 2 years. It was, by both accounts that have surfaced in the aftermath, a genuinely good time. Richard was attentive without being suffocating. He made Eleanor laugh consistently, which was something she had not expected and did not take for granted. He showed up when he said he would. He remembered the things she told him and referenced them later, which signaled a quality of attention that she valued. There were the normal frictions of two people past 50 building something new, the adjustments of schedule, of habit, of preference that any relationship requires, but nothing that felt insurmountable. Eleanor let herself be happy in the way that people who have been self-sufficient for a long time sometimes have to give themselves permission to be, deliberately, with a small, private acknowledgement that this was good, and she was allowed to accept it. She did not tell Richard about the trust. Charles asked, once, during their periodic meeting in the spring of 2018, whether Eleanor had discussed her financial situation with Richard. Eleanor said she hadn't yet. Charles asked whether she planned to. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone who is not uncertain about the facts, but uncertain about the timing. She said she planned to at the right moment. Charles did not push. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the particular logic of that position. He had watched Patricia hold a similar privacy for 50 years. He knew the weight of it, the shape of it, the way it became less a choice and more a way of being in the world after a certain amount of time. Richard proposed in Charleston in April of 2018, a real proposal, a weekend they had planned as a trip, a dinner that Richard had arranged with care, a ring he had chosen himself after asking Eleanor's closest friend for guidance on what Eleanor would actually wear. He told her, over that dinner, without performance or pretense, that she had changed his life, that he hadn't expected to feel the way he felt, that he wanted to keep feeling it for the rest of the time he had. Eleanor said yes, and meant it. She was 57 years old, and she was in love with a man who made her laugh, and who showed up, and who seemed, for all his noise about his portfolio and his self-made story, to genuinely see her. She believed that. She held on to that belief through everything that followed, even when the evidence began to complicate it. A few weeks after the engagement, Richard had a long dinner with his daughter Diana. Diana was 32, practical, professionally accomplished, and deeply protective of her father, in a way that had been intensified by watching the divorce from his first marriage strip away a significant portion of what he had built. She had been polite to Eleanor throughout the courtship, genuinely polite, not just performatively so, but polite is not the same as comfortable, and Diana had never quite reached comfort where Eleanor was concerned. She couldn't locate Eleanor's angle. She couldn't identify what Eleanor was after. In Diana's experience, people in relationships were always after something: security, validation, status, companionship. Eleanor seemed to already have all of those things, which made Diana's antenna go up rather than down, because if Eleanor didn't appear to need anything from Richard, then either Eleanor was exactly what she seemed to be, or there was something Diana wasn't seeing. She raised the subject of a prenuptial agreement with her father at that dinner. She was careful about it. She knew Richard well enough to know that approaching it as an accusation against Eleanor would make him defensive and less likely to act. She framed it instead as what she believed it to be: basic protection for a man who had worked 3 decades to build something and had already lost a portion of it once, through a divorce that had cost him in ways he still felt. She wasn't suggesting Eleanor was untrustworthy. She was suggesting that love and legal protection were not mutually exclusive, and that a man in Richard's position, entering a marriage at 60 years old, would be prudent to make sure his assets were documented and protected regardless of how certain he felt about the outcome. Richard had already been thinking along these lines. He told Diana he'd spoken to his attorney, Gerald Sims, who had handled his business affairs and some personal legal matters for a decade, about it. Diana exhaled. She felt, in that moment, that she had discharged the responsibility she felt she owed her father. She could not have known, sitting at that dinner table, that the prenup her father was about to put in motion would become the document that most clearly revealed the depth of his own assumptions about the woman he was marrying. Gerald Sims was a competent attorney. He was not a specialist in high-asset prenuptial agreements, but he was solid and experienced enough to handle what he understood the situation to be: a moderately successful businessman wanting to protect his commercial portfolio before entering a second marriage. He drew up a standard agreement. It covered Richard's 6 commercial properties, the business structures surrounding them, the accumulated equity. It required, as any prenuptial agreement requires, that Eleanor disclose her assets as well. Gerald sent the disclosure forms to Eleanor's attorney, whose name he had been given as Charles Wentworth of Wentworth & Associates. He had to look Wentworth up. The firm was small, without a significant public profile. Gerald assumed he was dealing with a solo practitioner who handled basic personal legal matters for a professor and her modest financial affairs. This assumption would turn out to be one of the most consequential errors of judgment Gerald made in 30 years of practice. And to understand why, you have to understand what the disclosure forms looked like when they came back. Eleanor's disclosure was clean and organized and completely accurate. She listed her home, owned outright, valued at approximately $600,000. She listed a retirement account. She listed personal savings. She listed, in the final category under inherited assets, a single line: inherited assets held in trust. See Addendum A. Addendum A was a single page. It named the Patricia Voss Irrevocable Family Trust in full. It identified the trustee as Wentworth & Associates. It named Eleanor as the sole beneficiary. It noted, correctly and with citation to the applicable legal authority, that the assets held within the trust were not subject to division under any marital property agreement as a matter of trust law and structure. It was everything that the law required. It disclosed the trust. It named the trust. It explained its structure and its legal character. What it did not contain was a dollar figure. Gerald read Addendum A. He then called Wentworth & Associates to ask a follow-up question about the trust's valuation. Charles Wentworth was not available. Gerald left a message. Charles did not return the call within the week. Gerald did not call again. He had other files. He was busy. He made a judgment call, which was that the trust was probably worth something modest, an inheritance of a few $100,000, given Eleanor's lifestyle and apparent financial profile, and he moved forward. He told Richard when they met to review the completed prenuptial documents that he thought they were fine. The prenup protected Richard's commercial portfolio. Eleanor's inherited trust, whatever it contained, wasn't marital property anyway. The document did what it needed to do. Richard signed. Eleanor signed, and in the offices of Wentworth & Associates, the full accounting of the Patricia Voss Irrevocable Family Trust sat in its files, undisturbed, patient, in the way that things built for the long term tend to be patient, because they don't need anything to happen on anyone else's timeline. They just need time. The wedding took place in September of 2018. It was small and beautiful. 70 guests at an inn on the Virginia coast. Good food, real music, an evening that people who attended still describe with warmth. Richard's toast made people cry. Eleanor's made people laugh. Diana gave a speech that was gracious in the genuine sense. She had decided, at least for that evening, to be fully present to the hope the occasion represented. Eleanor's closest friends drank too much champagne and danced until the staff started stacking chairs around them. Eleanor went to bed that night genuinely, straightforwardly happy, in the way that people who have not expected happiness sometimes experience it when it arrives, with a quality of surprise that makes it sharper and cleaner than expected. The first year of the marriage was good. It was not without its tensions. Diana remained at a polite distance that Eleanor couldn't quite close, and Richard's habit of narrating his business decisions at dinner, at considerable length, was something Eleanor had to make active peace with on a recurring basis. But the fundamental structure of the marriage was sound. They were companions in the real sense. They made each other laugh. They traveled together twice and discovered they had compatible travel rhythms, which is not a given and which Eleanor had privately considered a meaningful data point. Richard was present in the ways that mattered. He paid attention. He showed up. He was not a man who disappeared into his work in a way that left his wife feeling like furniture. The second year was harder. Richard's commercial portfolio hit a rough patch. A major tenant in his largest building vacated without warning, and the process of finding a replacement while carrying the overhead of an empty property put real strain on his finances and, as a consequence, on his mood. He became stressed in ways he didn't manage particularly well. He was short-tempered in the evenings. He worked late. He canceled plans. Eleanor was steady through this period, patient, supportive, present without being intrusive. She helped him think through options. She sat with him through difficult conversations. She did not push when he wanted quiet. She was, in the vocabulary of long marriages, a good partner to him in that stretch. Richard knew it. He said so, more than once, in the moments when the stress eased enough for gratitude to surface. But during the worst of that stretch, there was a conversation. They were arguing, not about money exactly, but about a refinancing arrangement Richard had put in place for one of his properties. A significant financial decision that Eleanor only heard about after the documents were signed. She had asked, simply, why he hadn't mentioned it beforehand, given that they were married, and financial decisions of that scale seemed like the kind of thing partners discussed. Richard's response was not vicious. It was not calculated. It was the unguarded response of a man under stress who had not examined his own assumptions carefully enough. "This is my money, Eleanor. I built this. It's mine." He said it the way people say true things they haven't thought through, with a certainty that comes not from cruelty, but from a framework so embedded that it doesn't feel like a framework at all. It just feels like reality. Eleanor did not respond to that in the moment. She let it go. She was not someone who needed to win every exchange, but she filed it. She was very good at filing things. By the third year, the filing cabinet had accumulated. The Diana situation had never resolved into warmth. Diana remained politely remote, and the effort Eleanor had spent trying to build a real relationship with her had gradually, quietly, wound down into an acceptance of what was apparently possible. Richard's stress from the second year had eased financially, but something in the dynamic of the marriage had shifted during that period in ways that didn't fully reverse when the financial pressure did. Richard had retreated into a version of their partnership where Eleanor was companion and presence and comfort, but not quite co-architect. She was in his life, she was not entirely in his plans. Eleanor recognized this. She had spent enough time in rooms where she was underestimated, in faculty politics, in the particular dismissals that came with being a woman of a certain age in an institution that valued different markers of importance, to know the feeling from the inside. The specific variety of not quite being seen that didn't come from malice, but from the accumulated weight of someone else's assumptions about who you were. Richard had decided, somewhere in the first year of the marriage, that he had Eleanor figured out. And once you have decided you have someone figured out, you stop looking for the information that would complicate the picture. In the spring of 2021, Richard Hargrove told Eleanor he wanted a divorce. He had thought about it, he said. He had talked to Gerald. He felt they had grown apart, wanted different things, moved in different directions, the kind of formulation that is true in some ways and insufficient in all of them. He was not unkind about it. He framed it as a mutual recognition, rather than a decision he had made unilaterally, though Eleanor was clear-eyed enough to understand that one of them had come to this conversation prepared and the other had not. He said he thought they could handle the dissolution reasonably, that there didn't have to be a significant legal proceeding, that the prenup was in place, which meant the framework was clear. Eleanor looked at him across the room they had shared for 3 years, and she felt something that she later described to her closest friend as a kind of crystallization. The moment when the picture you have been looking at resolves into its actual shape and you understand, finally, precisely what you have been seeing. She said she understood. She said, of course. She said she would have Charles reach out to Gerald. Richard nodded. He was relieved. He thought he knew what that meant. He thought he knew what was coming next. He was wrong. Again. Charles Wentworth called Gerald Sims on a Wednesday morning in April of 2021. Gerald knew the name. He had dealt with Wentworth's office during the prenuptial process 3 years earlier, and he picked up the phone expecting a routine conversation. A brief professional exchange about dissolution timelines, confirmation that the prenup would hold, discussion about next steps. What he got was something with a different quality entirely. Charles Wentworth was 61 years old by this point, and he had spent 3 decades in the company of very significant wealth. He was not a man who telegraphed or rushed or performed confidence he didn't have. He told Gerald at the opening of the call that he was reaching out as a professional courtesy before the formal discovery process began, because he wanted to make sure both parties were working from the same understanding of the financial landscape. Gerald said he believed he had a fairly clear picture of that landscape. Charles said, pleasantly and without apparent drama, that he wasn't certain that was entirely the case. He mentioned the Patricia Voss irrevocable family trust. He noted that since the time of the prenuptial agreement, the trust's value had grown in ways that were material to certain aspects of the dissolution. He was careful not to characterize Eleanor's position in a way that would be adversarial before it needed to be. But he mentioned, in the precise and measured way of a man who has been keeping careful track for 3 decades, that there were aspects of the financial accounting from the marital period that Eleanor's team would be bringing to the court's attention. And he suggested, as a courtesy, that Gerald might want to ensure Richard had provided a complete accounting of his own business transactions during those 3 years. Gerald asked, carefully, what scale of trust they were discussing. There was a brief pause on the line. Charles said he would recommend that Gerald review the full disclosure package when it arrived at the end of the week. Gerald would want to give himself time to review it carefully, he said. Gerald Sims received the disclosure package on a Friday afternoon. He read through it over the weekend. He called Richard Hargrove first thing Monday morning and asked him to come into the office as soon as possible. Richard came in expecting a straightforward meeting about the dissolution process. Gerald closed the door and told him to sit down, and then he told him, the Patricia Voss Irrevocable Family Trust, as of the date of the disclosure package, was valued at $206 million. Eleanor Voss Hargrove, the woman in the 10-year-old Subaru, the English professor, the woman Richard had spent 3 years certain he had figured out, was worth, by net estimate, including her personal assets outside the trust, approximately $209 million. Richard sat in that office chair and did not speak for a long time. Gerald, who had sat across from clients in some of the most difficult moments of their lives across 30 years, later told a colleague it was one of the quietest rooms he had ever occupied. When Richard finally spoke, the first thing he said was, "Why didn't she tell me?" And that is the most human question Richard Hargrove asked in the entire arc of this story. It deserves a real answer, and we will get to that answer. But it was not the question Richard spent most of his time on in the days and weeks that followed. The question he spent most of his time on was the one his new attorney, a high-asset divorce specialist named David Park, helped him formulate, whether any of that money could be reached. Richard retained David Park within 2 weeks of that Monday morning meeting, after parting ways with Gerald in a manner that was more businesslike than acrimonious. Richard did not blame Gerald for missing the scale of the trust. He blamed, with various degrees of clarity, the process, the disclosure documents, the insufficient language of Addendum A, and, in his more honest moments, himself, though that last one was the hardest to land on, and the one he returned to least often. David Park's theory of the case, developed in late-night working sessions that Richard described as the most intensive legal conversations he had ever had, went roughly as follows. Eleanor had failed to make full and fair financial disclosure during the prenuptial process. The specific dollar value of the trust had been withheld from the disclosure documents in a manner that, while technically compliant with a narrow reading of the applicable law, violated the spirit of full and fair disclosure that prenuptial agreements are supposed to embody. If a court agreed with that characterization, if it found that the prenup was voidable on grounds of inadequate disclosure, then the marriage would be governed by standard marital property law. And under standard marital property law, 3 years of marriage created certain entitlements. Richard was not seeking $200 million. He understood, with David's clear-eyed assistance, that that was not a realistic outcome. But if the prenup fell, and if the right arguments were made about financial equity during the marriage, a settlement in the range of several $1,000,000 above what the prenup allowed was not, in David's view, impossible. The motion challenging the prenuptial agreement was filed in June of 2021. It rested on the argument that Eleanor had not made adequate disclosure of her financial situation at the time of signing, that Addendum A had been deliberately constructed to technically reference the trust while functionally obscuring its scale, and that Richard, had he understood the true picture, would have approached the agreement entirely differently. This was not an implausible argument. Courts have voided prenuptial agreements on disclosure grounds before, in cases where assets were actively concealed or disclosures were structured to mislead. David Park was betting that a court would see this situation as falling close enough to that line to warrant a second look. Charles Wentworth's response was filed in late July. It was 42 pages long, and it was, in the estimation of every attorney who reviewed it, as meticulous as anything they had encountered in the matrimonial context. It walked through every element of the disclosure process with documentary precision. It reproduced Addendum A in full and cited the legal standard for trust disclosure in the applicable jurisdiction, demonstrating that every element of that standard had been met. It produced the letter that Charles's office had sent to Gerald Sims offering a follow-up consultation. It produced the phone log showing that Gerald had called once and that the call had not been returned within the period when Gerald decided to move forward. It noted, in language that was polite without being anything other than direct, that at no point in the 18 months between the signing of the prenuptial agreement and the wedding had Richard Hargrove, Gerald Sims, or any representative of their interests requested a formal valuation of the Patricia Voss Irrevocable Family Trust. The brief closed with a line that became, in the legal community that was paying attention to this case, somewhat notable. Failure to ask is not the same as failure to disclose. The preliminary hearing was held in September of 2021. Judge Marilyn Cross had been on the family court bench for 19 years. She had presided over 347 divorce cases. She had a reputation for two things and two things only: efficiency and an almost preternatural ability to identify, within the first hour of any proceeding, which party had not done their homework. David Park made his argument carefully and with genuine skill. This was not a weak attorney making a weak case, and it should be understood that way. He laid out the disclosure objections methodically. He argued for the equitable principle that a prenuptial agreement is supposed to give both parties a real understanding of what they're agreeing to, and that when one party structures their disclosure to comply with the letter of the law while withholding the information that would have materially affected the other party's understanding, the spirit of the agreement has been compromised. Charles Wentworth, appearing in person for the first time in these proceedings, responded from the same position of unruffled precision he had occupied throughout. He walked the court through the timeline, the disclosure, the addendum, the letter to Gerald, the phone log. He noted, with documentary support for every assertion, that the information Richard now claimed he had been denied was information that had been available, by name, by structure, by trustee, by explicit reference in the prenuptial agreement itself, throughout the entire process. What had not been provided was a number, and a number had not been provided because Richard's attorney had not asked for one in the manner required to compel a formal valuation response. Judge Cross listened to both sides. She asked David Park a single question. At the time of the prenuptial agreement, did your client or his counsel request a formal valuation of the trust listed in Addendum A? David Park said they had relied on the characterization provided by opposing counsel. Judge Cross wrote something on her notepad. She took the matter under advisement. She did not rule from the bench. But people who had watched Marilyn Cross for years said that the quality of her attention during Charles Wentworth's presentation and the particular brevity of her question to David Park told a readable story about which direction the wind was blowing. She issued her ruling in November of 2021, 14 pages. She upheld the prenuptial agreement in full. Her reasoning was direct and comprehensive, and left very little ambiguity about the analysis she had applied. She found that Eleanor's disclosures had met the applicable legal standard. She found that the Patricia Voss Irrevocable Family Trust had been disclosed by name, by structure, by trustee, and by explicit reference in the body of the prenuptial agreement. She found that Wentworth and Associates had offered a further consultation that had not been pursued. She found that the standard of due diligence in a prenuptial context requires both parties to conduct reasonable inquiry into disclosed assets, and that a failure to conduct that inquiry does not subsequently constitute grounds to challenge the agreement. Her final sentence on the prenup challenge was the one that circulated afterward. This court does not hold that concealment occurred. It holds that a question was available to be asked and was not asked, and that this failure of inquiry does not constitute grounds to void an otherwise valid agreement. Richard Hargrove's commercial portfolio was protected. The prenup had done exactly what Diana had asked it to do, exactly what Gerald had designed it to do. Richard walked away from that marriage with his $5 million intact. What he did not walk away with was any access to Eleanor's $200 million. And what Eleanor walked away with was precisely what she had entered the marriage with, plus her share of the marital contributions, cleanly calculated and documented by Charles Wentworth's office over the course of a final settlement negotiation that concluded in February of 2022. Eleanor did not ask for anything beyond what was mathematically hers from the marital period. She did not seek to punish Richard. She did not leverage the scale of her wealth in ways that would have been legal and possible. She asked for a clean separation. She got one. Richard Hargrove left that marriage with everything the prenup had promised him. He had gotten exactly what he asked for. He just hadn't understood when he asked for it that he was the one it was primarily protecting. Not from Eleanor taking his money, from the far more ordinary consequence of having spent 3 years not actually knowing the woman he had married. Eleanor went back to work in the fall of 2022. She returned to the house she had owned outright before the marriage, the one she had gone back to after the settlement, and she settled back into her rhythms, the early mornings with coffee and books, the walk across campus, the particular satisfaction of a seminar where the students were actually reading and actually thinking. She was not performatively fine. She was genuinely fine, in the deep way of someone who has always had their foundation under them, even when the floor above it was shifting. The marriage had cost her something that she was honest enough not to minimize. The loss of what she had believed she was building with Richard. The loss of the specific hope of being known fully by a person who had chosen her. That was real. She gave it the weight it deserved, and then she kept moving, because she was Patricia Voss's daughter, and Patricia Voss's daughters kept moving. She gave one interview to a small regional magazine in the early spring of 2023. The interviewer asked the question everyone asked: why hadn't she told Richard the truth about her financial situation? Eleanor's answer was measured and honest, in a way that the people who read it found more affecting than a dramatic revelation would have been. She said her mother had taught her that money was private until there was a reason to make it otherwise. She said she had always expected to have the conversation with Richard, that she had been waiting for the right moment, the right context, the quality of trust that would make the number feel like something they could hold together rather than something that would change the shape of everything. She had been waiting for him to see her as a partner fully enough that showing him the whole picture felt safe. That moment, she said, had never come. And then, quietly, if he had handled that number with grace, I think we might have had a real marriage. I was trying to find out. I waited too long. It is the most unguarded thing Eleanor Voss has said publicly about any of this. And it tells you something important about the cost of the silence that her mother taught her. Not the financial cost, because Eleanor was protected from that completely. The personal cost. The cost of armor that was built for one era and worn into another. The cost of waiting for a moment of trust that never came, because you never gave it the conditions in which it could come. Patricia Voss had been private about money, because that privacy was protective and necessary, and sometimes survival. Eleanor Voss was private about money because her mother had been, and because the habit was deep and the reasoning was sound, and because the right moment was always slightly further ahead than the current one. These are understandable reasons. They are also, in the end, reasons that cost her the chance to be known. What happened in the fall of 2023 was not something anyone who knew Eleanor well anticipated. Charles Wentworth did not anticipate it. Her closest friends did not anticipate it. Richard Hargrove certainly did not anticipate it, though by that point he had apparently adopted a policy of not anticipating anything where Eleanor was concerned, which was perhaps the most correct posture he had yet managed. What Eleanor did, 18 months after the settlement, was establish a foundation. The Patricia Voss Foundation for Financial Literacy and Women's Independence launched in October of 2023 with an initial endowment of $12 million, a number that was both meaningful and, in the context of Eleanor's actual wealth, representative of a beginning rather than a conclusion. The foundation's stated mission was to provide financial education, legal resources, and practical support to women navigating major financial transitions, divorce, inheritance, widowhood, career change, the moments when women who have been operating inside financially opaque arrangements, whether those arrangements were imposed by partners or by culture or by their own careful self-protection, suddenly need to understand where they stand and what they have and what their options are. Women, specifically, over the age of 45. Women who did not have a Charles Wentworth. Women who did not have a Patricia. Eleanor gave a brief public statement at the foundation's launch. She spoke about her mother. She spoke about what it had meant to watch Patricia build something real and lasting in a world that had not invited her to the table. She spoke about the women she wanted the foundation to reach, women who were in the dark, not by their own choice but by the circumstance of relationships and dynamics and a culture that had not historically made financial transparency inside partnerships a priority or even a norm. And she said something at the close of the statement that has stayed with the people who heard it. She said, "My mother taught me to be private about money because that privacy was protection. For a long time, I believed that was wisdom without expiration. But I have been thinking about what it costs to extend a lesson past its context. To protect yourself so well that you never get to be seen. My mother was extraordinary, and she was largely invisible. She did not mind. I am not certain, anymore, that I want the same thing. This foundation is my attempt to ensure that other women do not have to choose between being protected and being known. I believe we have been making that choice long enough." Eleanor Voss, the quiet woman with $200 million and a sensible car and a well-worn faculty parking pass, had decided, at 60 years old, at the end of a marriage that had ended exactly as the law specified it should, with every dollar accounted for and every document in order, and not a single thing that could be called unfair, to be a little more visible. Patricia, somewhere in whatever she believed in, might have found this unnecessary. She might have raised an eyebrow at the public statement, at the foundation's launch event, at the modest degree of exposure Eleanor had accepted in service of a mission that Patricia probably would have pursued through a different, quieter channel. But Eleanor is her mother's daughter in the ways that matter most. Precise, patient, long-sighted, unhurried. And she has arrived, through her own version of the long path, at her own version of the lesson. You don't have to show your hand until you're ready. But when you're ready, you play it. And you make sure the women who come after you know how the game is structured. Richard Hargrove has been, by all accounts, very quiet about this chapter of his life. That is new behavior for him. He still owns his commercial properties. He still manages them personally. He has not, as far as anyone close to the situation is aware, spoken publicly about Eleanor, about the prenup, about the proceedings, about any of it. This is perhaps the clearest evidence that he has understood something from all of this. Though what, precisely, he has understood, we can't say with certainty. People are rarely transparent about the lessons that cost them the most to learn. Diana Hargrove reached out to Eleanor in the summer of 2022, a personal message, not through an attorney, asking if they could have coffee. Eleanor said yes. What was said between them is private. What we know from someone close to Diana is that Diana came away from that conversation with a fundamentally different picture of the woman her father had married than the one she had carried for 5 years. Not because Eleanor had changed, because Diana, for the first time, was seeing Eleanor without the filter of assumption that had colored every interaction from the beginning. Eleanor had never been after Richard's money. She had never needed it. She had never been playing any game that Diana had been able to identify from the outside, because the game Diana had been looking for, the strategic pursuit of a wealthy man's assets by a woman with less, had not been the game Eleanor was playing. Eleanor had simply been there, in the marriage, in the house, in the relationship, present without agenda, in possession of more than anyone in Richard's orbit had imagined, waiting for a moment of trust that the marriage ultimately couldn't produce. Diana reportedly sat with that for a while. It takes time to reprocess a picture you thought you understood. It takes time to locate the assumptions you were making so automatically that you didn't know they were assumptions. Diana was, by accounts, not a person who avoided that kind of reckoning. She did it. It changed some things. What it changed, specifically, we don't know. But she had coffee with Eleanor. Eleanor said yes, that is something. There is a version of this story that is satisfying in the way that certain stories are satisfying. The underestimated woman revealed. The overconfident man corrected. The legal system functioning with precision. The numbers speaking for themselves at the end. That version is not wrong, but it is the surface of a deeper story, and the deeper story is the one that stays with you. The deeper story is about the particular cost of silence, not Eleanor's legal silence, which protected her completely and was fully justified in its construction, but her personal silence. The cost of moving through a marriage without letting the other person see the whole picture. The cost of inheriting a lesson built for one context and applying it in another without examining whether the fit was still right. The cost of waiting for the right moment until the accumulation of unright moments became the marriage itself. Patricia Voss built $200 million without the world's recognition and without apparently needing it. Eleanor Voss carried that wealth into a marriage and out of it, and into a foundation that bears her mother's name, and is doing something her mother likely would not have done with it. Letting some light in, letting people see a corner of what's there, making the visibility itself into a tool for someone else's protection and knowledge and freedom. This is not a repudiation of Patricia's approach. It is a daughter's evolution of it, a next chapter that honors the source while finding its own shape. And that, in the end, is what this story is actually about. Not a prenup. Not $200 million versus $5 million. Not a judge's ruling or a legal brief or a phone log from an attorney's office in 2018. It is about the stories that get passed between women across generations, the practical wisdom, the protective habits, the ways of moving through a world that was not designed with your full participation in mind. It is about the cost of those habits, and the value of those habits, and the work of figuring out, at every stage of life, which habits are still serving you, and which ones have become their own kind of cage. Patricia's silence served Patricia. It served Eleanor, legally and financially, in every way that the law can measure. What it did not serve was Eleanor's chance to be fully known by the person she had chosen. That chance passed. The marriage ended. Eleanor is fine. More than fine. She has always been more than fine. What she is now, in a way she hasn't always been, is visible. And if you've been watching this from the beginning, if something in this story landed for you, if you recognize something in Eleanor or in Patricia, or in the particular exhaustion of being underestimated by someone who was supposed to see you, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me whether you think Eleanor made the right call by waiting. Tell me what you would have done, sitting at that dining room table, listening to a man say, "This is my money. I built this. It's mine." When you were sitting on $200 million and the patience to outlast every assumption he had ever made about you. And if there is a woman in your life who needs to hear this story, a woman who has been quiet about what she's built, or quiet about what she's worth, or quiet in the way that women learn to be quiet when the world teaches them that visibility is risk, share this video with her. Because this story is for her too. New stories post every week here on Betrayed Heart Tales. Make sure you are subscribed. Make sure the notification bell is on, because the next story is coming, and I promise you, you are not going to see it coming either.